When the corrupt millionaire forced my son to kneel over a stained sweater, he mistook my silence for surrender. Completely unaware I was quietly orchestrating his absolute financial death sentence. People often say that an old man's silence is a sign of cowardice and resignation. My name is Lars Moller, 67 years old. On the exact day of the Midsummer Festival, standing exactly 8 steps away from my son, I had to watch helplessly as my proud boy was forced by his wealthy father-in-law to kneel down on the grass stained with barbecue sauce. He had to humiliatingly pick up every scattered piece of meat just to apologize for the ruined $450 sweater of that man. Over 20 upper-class guests held their breath, waiting for me to rush forward and knock out that arrogant man with my calloused hands that had once bent steel rebar. But I didn't step forward. I chose a silence that was brutally ruthless. He smirked, triumphantly thinking he had completely crushed the pride and self-esteem of my son and me. But that corrupt former tax inspector didn't know that the moment I swallowed my bitter hatred was the exact spark that ignited a financial death sentence for him. He didn't know I was holding fatal evidence hidden in the dark, a weapon powerful enough to crush his entire empire and protect the $520,000 property he was scheming to steal. Without screaming, without spilling a single drop of blood, I let him dig his own grave using his own arrogance. Before I tell you how an old shipbuilder turned the tables and forced the villain to personally sign the decree that stripped him of everything, please hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below to let me know what impressed and intrigued you the most about this story. People often say that an old man's silence is a sign of cowardice and resignation. But they don't know that sometimes silence is the sound of a blade being sharpened. My name is Lars Moller. I am 67 years old this year. I have spent 44 years of my life as a veteran shipbuilder and carpenter in Denmark. My hands are a map of scars, rough calluses, and a grayish burn from welding in 1990 imprinted on my thumb that will never fade. Astrid, my late wife, used to love using her fingers to caress that scar whenever we sat next to each other. She said it was proof that I could survive any storm. But Astrid left me 4 years ago on a cold October day. Now, waking up every morning at 6 o'clock, the rumbling sound of the coffee maker is the only thing anchoring me to the empty house in Odense. The greatest legacy, and also the only weakness that Astrid left me, is Emil, our only 34-year-old son. Emil is a brilliant wind energy engineer, carrying within him his mother's precision and my steady hands. During the first 32 years of his life, every time I saw the boy walk into a room, I always felt that Astrid and I had done at least one thing right in this world. But then he married Freya Knudsen, and for the past 18 months, I have had to watch helplessly as my son was slowly drained of his vitality by a family of nouveau riche. On June 21, 2024, the Midsummer Festival, I drove to Randers to attend an outdoor barbecue at the mansion of Henrik Knudsen, Emil's father-in-law. Henrik is a corrupt former tax inspector who turned into a real estate conglomerate boss. His mansion reeked of ostentatious money with a stark white-painted fence, solid iron gates, and men in designer clothes holding craft beers and laughing boisterously. Henrik is 61 years old this year. He always carried the arrogant demeanor of someone who assumed that every square meter he stepped on belonged to him. But what made the blood in my veins boil was not his boasting, but the sight that caught my eyes as soon as I stepped through the gate. Under the glaring sun of the summer noon, my son, an engineer with a prestigious degree, was wearing an old apron, drenched in sweat, holding tongs with both hands and standing frozen, next to a grill reeking of charcoal smoke. He had been standing there since 8:30 in the morning, managing dozens of slabs of ribs, serving over 20 upper-class guests of the Knudsen family, without a single one bothering to say thank you. The boy looked visibly haggard with dark circles prominent under his eyes. Meanwhile, Henrik stood not far from the grill, wearing a $450 handmade wool sweater, occasionally snapping his fingers and ordering, "Emil, dry those ribs. You let them burn too much last time." Emil just clenched his jaw and softly replied, "Yes, father," then quietly complied. A few steps away, Freya, Emil's wife, was standing with her arms crossed, chatting with her trendy friends. She held a glass of wine, laughing and flirting, and absolutely never once glanced at her husband, who was sweating profusely to serve her family. I sat on a folding chair in the corner of the yard, my calloused hands already curling into fists, pressed tightly against my thighs. The loud, bustling atmosphere of the party reached its peak at 12:30 noon. That was when the fateful incident occurred. Emil used both hands to carry a large aluminum tray filled with grilled ribs glowing with dark red sauce. The tray of meat was very heavy, and the boy had to carefully grope his way step by step on the uneven grass. Henrik was standing in the middle of the yard at this time, waving his glass of beer and telling some bland joke. Suddenly, he took a very strong step backward, a completely intentional collision, and his elbow smashed straight into the tray of meat in Emil's hands. Crash! The aluminum tray slammed hard into the ground. The thick, dark red barbecue sauce splashed everywhere, splashing straight onto Henrik's expensive $450 wool sweater. The country music stopped abruptly. Every conversation in the garden was cut off. Over 20 upper-class people held their breath, creating a deadly and suffocatingly eerie silence. Henrik looked down at the stain on his shirt, then slowly looked up at Emil. He didn't scream. He used a deep voice, gritting out each word 100 times colder and more cruel than a scream. "You are an uneducated fool, Emil." My son's face turned pale. "Dad, I am sorry. It was an accident. You just stepped back into me. I stepped into you." Henrik hissed, his eyes sharp as a razor. "You have been carrying things your whole life, and you can't even do a trivial thing right. This shirt costs $450. It is more expensive than your father's entire wardrobe of rags combined." I stood up abruptly from my chair. Henrik pointed his finger straight down at the sauce-stained grass, his voice ringing out clearly, forcing everyone to hear. "Pick it up. Kneel your knees down on this grass, pick up every piece of meat, and apologize to me in front of everyone here. If not, get out of my house right now." The whole garden was silent. I looked around. Not a single guest dared to utter a word. Freya still stood with her arms crossed by the pool, turning her face away as if watching a boring play she didn't want to be involved in. And then I saw Emil's Adam's apple move. He was swallowing something sharp as broken glass. Then slowly my proud son dropped to both knees onto the sauce-soaked grass. The hands that had designed multi-million-dollar wind turbines were now trembling, picking up each charred piece of meat and putting it back into the tray. "I am sorry, Henrik," Emil said, his voice trying to stay calm, but the humiliation had choked every syllable. Above him, Henrik looked down with a smirk of ultimate satisfaction. He had won. He had trampled on the dignity of my son and me. At that moment, I stood exactly 8 steps away from Henrik Knudsen. With 44 years of experience as a shipbuilder, I knew exactly how much force it took to bend steel rebar, and I was more than capable of stepping forward and smashing that arrogant rich man's jaw before he could even blink. My muscles coiled up, The tips of my shoes were ready to lunge forward, but at that very moment Emil looked up. The boy's eyes caught mine. It wasn't an angry look, it was the desperate plea of someone being backed into a corner. Those eyes seemed to scream, "Dad, please don't. Don't make things worse." My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I stopped. I pressed my two hands, bulging with blue veins, tightly against my thighs. I took a deep breath through my teeth, suppressing the fury that wanted to burn this entire garden down. Standing and watching my son kneel to pick up dirty pieces of meat in helplessness was the most cruel thing a father had to endure. But I understood that if I threw a punch, I would become the violent villain, just as Henrik wanted. He wanted me to lose control. I didn't step forward. I chose a silence that was ruthlessly cruel. When Emil stood up, carrying the tray full of humiliation, and turned to walk away, I quietly turned and left the party. Not a single scream, not a single curse. Henrik patted my shoulder as I left, his fake smile grinning. "Drive safely, Lars." I looked straight into the deep pit of arrogance in his eyes, responding in a tone as cold as the North Sea ice. "We will meet again soon, Henrik." I walked out to my car and locked the doors tight. A quiet atmosphere enveloped me, but inside my chest, a cold and cruel decision had been made. The 8 steps I had just held back were not cowardice. It was the perfect running start for a bloodless counterattack that would cause Henrik Knudsen's entire empire to collapse until not a single fragment remained. He wanted to force us to our knees. I would make him personally sign his own financial death sentence. That night in Odense, I couldn't sleep. 10:30, 12:30 at night, 2 in the morning, 2:30. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Emil dropping to both knees on the grass, stained with barbecue sauce, under the contemptuous gaze of Henrik Knudsen, tore my mind apart. The familiar wooden house on Molestian Street sank into a thick silence, so suffocating that I could hear the blood pounding beat by beat in my veins. The fury I had swallowed down that afternoon was now fermenting, turning into a cruel poison, tearing at my chest. There is a very fragile boundary between endurance and cowardice. Watching your son get trampled on without being able to throw a punch is the most cruel kind of torture for a father. I broke into a cold sweat. I stepped out of bed, staggering toward the closet. In the dark, my 2 hands full of welding scars reached up to the highest shelf, pulling down a dusty oak box. It was Astrid's memory box. The box I had kept sealed for 4 years, ever since that cold October day when she took her last breath. When the lid opened, Astrid's scent, a faint lavender mixed with the smell of old paper, rushed straight into my senses and made my heart feel like it had stopped beating. I clenched my teeth, trembling as I dug through the old keepsakes, her tortoise shell reading glasses, the wooden bead necklace she used to wear, the family photo taken on Bornholm Island. And then, lying deep at the bottom of the box, buried under a layer of old sweaters, was an unsealed white envelope. The outside of the envelope bore only a single word, Emil, written in my wife's slanted, decisive handwriting. My hands went stiff. I slowly pulled the paper out from inside. Astrid's handwriting filled 3/4 of the page. At the top corner was a date that sent a chill down my spine. Christmas Eve, 10 months before she passed away. That was the time Astrid was still lucid enough, still often sitting quietly at the kitchen table with accounting ledgers. Lars, the writing began, stabbing straight into my mind like a sharp knife. I don't know whether I should give this letter to you, but I don't have much time left. Lars, I don't trust the Knudsen family. I have tried to find a reason to be wrong, but my intuition is never wrong. Just look at the way Henrik Knudsen looks at our Emil. He doesn't look at a son-in-law. He looks at a tool he can use to drain dry. I held my breath. My eyes were glued to the following lines, feeling the world around me shaking. Lars, when things get worse, and I know for sure they will get worse, please don't resolve it with your fists. They want you to lose control. You must use your cold head. I have left something for you, clipped underneath the letter. I found a tiny yellow sticky note. On it, Astrid wrote exactly 3 short words, underlined twice with red ink. Protect the house. Right below that was a name and a phone number. Lawyer Pernille Holm. My bedroom seemed to be drained of oxygen. My wife, a former accountant with a terrifyingly sharp mind, had seen through the Knudsen family's wicked ambitions before they even had a chance to act. She didn't leave me weak tears. From beyond the grave, Astrid had laid out a legal trap and waited for me to step in and activate it. The anger inside me suddenly vanished, replaced by a frighteningly cold alertness. The enemy had taken one step ahead, but they didn't know that my wife had stayed one lifetime ahead of them. At 8:45 the next morning, I pushed the door and stepped into lawyer Pernille Holm's office on Sondergade Street, right in the center of Aarhus. There was no fancy reception, no flashy leather sofa sets. Pernille was a woman in her 50s, her eyes sharp as a razor, wearing square-framed glasses and radiating the aura of a woman who would never accept lies. Mr. Moller, Pernille pushed up her glasses, her voice steady but firm. I have been waiting for you to show up here for a long time. I sat down on the opposite chair, placing Astrid's sticky note on the table. My wife came to see you. That is correct. Pernille leaned back in her chair, pulling out a thick grey file from the drawer. Mrs. Astrid came to find me on a spring day, using her maiden name so as not to alert anyone, and what she asked me to investigate will make you shudder. She threw the file onto the table. A dry sound echoed. Henrik Knudsen isn't just a nouveau riche who likes to humiliate others. Lars, Pernille gritted out every word, her eyes drilling straight into me. He is a corrupt, former tax inspector. Using his dark underground connections, Henrik secretly investigated all your real estate valuation data from 2 years ago. He knows exactly that your house in Odense is currently valued at $520,000. I gripped the armrests of the chair tightly with both hands. He is targeting my house. He is targeting everything you own. Pernille slammed her hand on the table, her sharp voice cutting through the space. Henrik Knudsen is in a severe cash flow shortage. He needs a massive asset to pump into his dying real estate projects. And Emil, your son, is the perfect pawn for them to legitimize the takeover. Your wife recognized this rotten stench. She asked me to block all efforts to transfer the name, putting in clauses to lock your ownership while she was still alive. A cold chill spread through my entire body. $520,000. The humiliation at the barbecue yesterday wasn't just a cheap power play. It was a deliberate psychological attack. Henrik wanted to trample on the pride of my son, and me wanted to isolate Emil, to turn my son into an obedient servant, thereby easily stealing all the assets of the Moller family. They are a bunch of parasites, I hissed through my teeth, clearly feeling the cruelty forming in my veins. Pernille leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the danger of an old hunting wolf. Screaming won't solve anything, Lars. To strip away their illusion of power, we must have destructive evidence. Your wife has finished building the fortress. Now it's time for you to gather the weapons. She pushed a piece of paper toward me. As soon as you leave this office, I need you to do 2 things immediately, Pernille ordered, her tone allowing no resistance. First, immediately check the joint bank account statements of you and Emil. Don't withdraw money, don't change anything, Just check if any other filthy name has been secretly attached to it. I nodded, my jaw clenched tight. Second. Pernille lowered her voice, a half-smile full of murderous intent appearing. I will arrange for you to meet someone. A hidden witness. A ghost from the Knudsen family's past that they thought was buried forever. He holds secrets that could send Henrik Knudsen straight to prison. When I walked out of Pernille's office onto the windy Sondergade street, I was no longer a widowed old shipbuilder, helplessly watching his son kneel down to pick up barbecue meat. Every step I took down the sidewalk now carried the weight of a sentence. Henrik Knudsen thought he was playing with a weak prey, but he didn't know that the darkness he created had accidentally awakened dormant beasts, and I, Lars Mola, would personally smash his crown of arrogance into unsalvageable fragments. The sky over the city of Aarhus that afternoon was grey and heavy, exactly like the way the truth was about to crush my chest. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, I parked my car at the Bauhaus hardware store parking lot. The smell of wet asphalt and car exhaust lingered in the cold air. I sat in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, waiting for a ghost from the past to appear. And then I saw him. Casper Nielsen, Freja's first husband, walked out of the store with a bag of screws in his hand. He used to be a promising middle school literature teacher, but the man standing in front of me now looked haggard, drained of vitality, exactly like a soulless corpse whose bone marrow had been sucked dry. When I stepped forward and called his name, Casper's eyes flashed with the high alert of a cornered wild animal. I am Lars Mola, Emil's father, I said, in a deep voice. Casper stopped, his eyes dropped, filled with a profound sadness. We sat inside his old sedan, rolling up the windows tightly. The narrow space inside the car was thick with suffocation. Henrik Knudsen isn't just a nouveau riche thirsty for power. Mr. Mola, Casper began, his voice steady but full of scratches. He is a cannibalistic monster who doesn't need fangs or claws. When I tried to protect my boundaries with Freya, he didn't scream or threaten. He just made one phone call. Casper turned to look straight into my eyes, his eyes streaked with red. Henrik called the principal of the school where I was teaching. He hinted at inappropriate behaviors, baseless rumors. No evidence, no formal accusations, but he used his underground power network to inject suspicion. 2 weeks later, my 10-year teaching career was completely ruined. Freja signed the divorce papers without any hesitation, as if I were an expired toy. I clenched my jaw, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. But that wasn't the bottom of the abyss. That's not all. Casper leaned forward, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper. Do you know the Thomsen family in Silkeborg? 4 years ago, Henrik approached them. Using a trapped contract containing ambiguous clauses buried on the 4th page, Henrik deceitfully stole their family's ancestral land. By the time the Thomsens found out, everything was absolutely legal. They don't use guns, sir. They use pieces of paper to kill people. Casper gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white, looking at me with desperate eyes. Your son is trapped in there, and your family is the next prey. At 4 in the afternoon, I drove back home like a man running away from a storm. The wooden house in Odense welcomed me with an eerie silence. Lawyer Pernille Holm's warning echoed in my head like a death knell. Check the bank account immediately. I rushed into the kitchen, yanked open the drawer, and pulled out the stack of joint bank account statements for Emil and me. It was the account I had set up when Astrid was still alive, used to cover emergency living expenses. My hands, full of welding scars, trembled as I turned each page, and then my heartbeat seemed to stop. At the top corner of the February statement, a third name had secretly and arrogantly appeared next to the names of me and my son, Freya Knudsen. My throat went dry. Hot blood rushed up my head. I never signed any authorization papers. They had forged the documents. Silently inserting parasitic tubes into my financial system right under my nose for months. A monster was silently devouring my family from the inside, and my son had no idea. But the peak of the horror only truly hit when darkness enveloped the house. At exactly 10:15 at night, a sharp knock rang out. Not the familiar knock from the back door, but the frantic, desperate pounding on the front door of someone being hunted down. I threw the door open. Emil stood there, his jacket soaked with the night dew, his shoulders slumping, his face as pale as a corpse. My proud son, the engineer who always held his head high, now looked as if someone had just drained his soul. "Come inside, son." I pulled him into the kitchen. Emil collapsed onto the wooden chair. He held his head, his fingers running deep into his messy hair. When he looked up, his eyes were bloodshot, but there wasn't a single tear. Those were the eyes of fury that had reached the limit of madness. "Dad!" Emil opened his mouth, his voice shattering into pieces. "I just called the maternity clinic. I used my rights as a husband to ask about Fraser's ultrasound appointment." Emil paused, his throat choked, letting out a stifled sob. "They have no records at all. There is no patient named Fraser Knudsen." I stood frozen. The air in the kitchen seemed to be sucked dry. She was never pregnant. "There is no child at all," Emil gritted out each word, pouring out his ultimate resentment. "Fraser has been deceiving us for the past 8 months. She used a non-existent life to manipulate me, forcing me to be a slave to her family, forcing me to kneel humiliatingly on the grass that day. She faked a pregnancy to keep me trapped for a more cruel plot." Before I could react, Emil reached into his soaking wet jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and threw it hard onto the table. "I found this in her desk drawer tonight." Emil gritted his teeth. I picked up the paper. It was the valuation printout of my house in Odense. The figure, $520,000, was printed clearly in bold. But the thing that made my blood boil like volcanic lava was the handwritten line in red ink in the margin. I recognized that arrogant handwriting immediately. Henrik Knudsen's handwriting. The line clearly stated, "Convince old Lars. Split later." My son and I looked at each other. The entire terrifying picture of the crime was complete. The fake pregnancy. The public humiliation at the party. The secret addition of the name to the bank account. They didn't just want to destroy Emil's self-esteem. They wanted to prove I was old and senile, wanted to use the non-existent child to strip away my legal control, and the ultimate goal was to steal the $520,000 house of the Moeller family to pump capital into Henrik's rotten real estate empire. Emil trembled violently with anger. "I will kill him. I will go back there and expose everything." "No," I growled, my calloused hands slamming hard onto the kitchen table, making the coffee cup bounce. I stepped closer, placing my hands on my son's trembling shoulders, my eyes sharp and calm like an iceberg. "I've been a carpenter for 44 years, Emil. I know how to build a frame, and I also know perfectly well how to bring down a building without using a noisy sledgehammer," I said slowly, transferring my coldness to him. "We will not scream. We will not punch them in the face. Loud anger is only for the weak." I gathered the bank statement with Freya's name, Casper Nielsen's testimony, and the house valuation with Henrik's handwriting into a single file. A deadly file. "Henrik Knudsen wants to force our family to our knees." I smirked, a rare, cruel smile appearing on my old face. Then we will use this exact piece of paper to lock his throat tight. I won't punch him. I will make him personally sign his own financial death sentence and force him to kneel down and beg us for his life." At exactly 8:30 the next morning, we were at lawyer Pernille Holm's office in central Aarhus. The air in the room was suffocating and thick with the smell of black coffee and extreme tension. Casper Nielsen was already sitting there, his figure thin but his eyes no longer holding the fear of a fugitive. When Emil walked in, the two men, two victims of the same parasitic family, looked at each other. They didn't need to say much. Just a nod was enough to confirm that this deadly alliance was officially established. Pernille sat at the head of the table, pushing her square-framed glasses up her nose. She opened the dreary grey file and began scattering each document onto the glass tabletop like a dealer turning over the trump cards. "What do we have?" Pernille growled, her eyes sweeping over the three of us men. "A bank statement showing that Freya Knudsen secretly inserted a suction tube into the joint account of you and your son without legal consent. A real estate valuation with Henrik Knudsen's bright red handwriting clearly stating, 'Convince old Lars, split later,' and Casper's sworn testimony about Henrik using underground power to force his divorce, plus evidence of the scam to seize the Thomson family's land in Silkeborg." She slammed her hand hard on the table, the harsh sound making Emil's chest jolt. "If this much evidence is taken to criminal court, Henrik will have a team of lawyers drag the case out for years," Pernille said, her voice cold as ice. "But we are not taking him to court. Megalomaniacs like Henrik aren't afraid of judges. They are only afraid of losing money and losing face. We will force him into a risk-cost equation. We won't threaten. We just announce that the bomb is in our hands and let him do the math himself." Pernille pushed a blank white piece of paper and a fountain pen toward me. "Mr. Moller, summarize it. The shorter it is, the more lethal it will be." I picked up the pen. My hands, which had held sledgehammers and welding machines for 44 years, didn't tremble at all. I didn't need lengthy legal jargon. I only needed the language of a carpenter who knows exactly how to bring down a building. I wrote exactly 4 sentences, the handwriting etching deeply into the paper. "Henrik, I am a 67-year-old shipbuilder who has built everything I own with my own sweat and blood. I know exactly the price of everything in this world. And I also know perfectly well how to tear them down into a pile of rubble. Leave my son alone and get out of our lives immediately. I think you are smart enough to understand where this pile of files will send your empire. Not a single curse, not a single scream demanding justice." The letter and all attached documents were sealed and sent by certified mail straight to Henrik's mansion in Randers that very afternoon. The silent bomb was activated. 3 days passed. Silence enveloped the wooden house in Odense. Emil paced restlessly in the living room, but I just sat sipping coffee, quietly watching the panic gnawing at the other end of the line. When you strip away a narcissist's control, your silence is the acid that corrodes their mind fastest. On Wednesday morning at 10:45, a sleek black sedan turned quietly into my driveway. No private driver, no flattering partners. Henrik Knudsen stepped out of the car alone. Under the authentic and ruthless light of the Danish morning, the once arrogant former tax inspector now looked like a deflated balloon. He wasn't wearing the $450 wool sweater, but a wrinkled jacket. His shoulders slumped, his steps were heavy, completely stripped of the arrogant aura of the man who had forced my son to kneel on the grass. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes darting around, not daring to look straight at me. I opened the door, coldly jutting my chin, step into the kitchen. Henrik sat down on the wooden chair opposite me. He placed both hands on the table, his plump fingers trembling uncontrollably. The space was so suffocating that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. "I read the letter," Henrik spoke up. His deep and arrogant tone had been choked off, leaving only the stifled sound of a man desperately trying to find a way out. I poured a cup of dark black coffee, pushed it toward him, but didn't invite him to drink. "Pernille Holm is a very careful lawyer," I smirked, my tone lacking a single ray of warmth. "She has prepared everything. Did you come here to surrender your life or to bargain?" Henrik swallowed hard. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a stack of pre-signed documents and pushed them across the table. I slowly turned each page. My eyes swept over the sharp legal text. The first page, a document cancelling all power of attorney and permanently severing all of Freya Knudsen's access to our joint bank account. The second page, a notarized property waiver. Henrik and Freya surrendered all rights, all legal claims to my $520,000 house in Odense. The entire illusion of power, the entire conspiracy to fake a pregnancy, brainwash Emil, and steal assets to pump capital into his rotten real estate empire, had been crushed by just a stack of paper. He didn't spill a drop of blood, but his entire crown had been smashed by me, right on the dining table, where my wife used to sit. "Frasier, she is not a bad daughter," Henrik suddenly spoke up, his voice breaking, carrying a pathetic sorrow. "She was just raised wrong. It's my fault." I stopped my hands, looking up straight into the pathetic abyss in his eyes. My chest churned with ultimate contempt. "You didn't raise her wrong, Henrik." I gritted out each word, sharp as broken glass. "You carved her into a perfect parasite exactly like you. You people suck the blood of decent folks because you have no ability to create any real value yourselves." Henrik squeezed his eyes shut. His face cringed as if he had just been slapped by a thunderbolt. He had no more excuses to cling to. I gathered the stack of papers, tapped them on the table, and stood up, my shadow looming over his shriveled figure. "These documents will stay in lawyer Pernille's safe. If your family ever dares to come near Emil, or my granddaughter even half a step, if your names ever appear in our lives again, I won't send a certified letter anymore. I will send your rotten pile of files straight to the Financial Investigation Bureau and your creditors. At that time, you won't just lose your license, but you will lose your whole life in prison." Henrik staggered to his feet. He looked around the small kitchen of the shipbuilder he had once despised, his eyes gleaming with late remorse and terror. "You built all of this with your own hands," Henrik whispered, his voice trembling. "That's right," I replied coldly, "and you should feel lucky because today I chose not to use these hands to destroy your family." Henrik Knudsen turned on his heel, silently trudging out the door. He got into the black sedan, started the engine, and drove out of sight down the gravel road. The illusion of a powerful nouveau riche had been permanently wiped out. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, flooded with winter sunlight, heard the clock chime 11 o'clock, and knew the battle was over, and I had crushed the monster's throat without needing to let out a single roar. The death of a parasite never makes a loud noise. When you drain the blood supply that feeds it, it simply shrivels up and falls to the bottom of the mud. That night, less than 10 hours after Henrik Knudsen dragged his feet out of my kitchen like a soulless ghost, Freya appeared at our house. She walked in with red eyes, her perfectly applied everyday makeup now completely smudged. The designer handbag in her hand trembled. She still thought she could act out the final act of the play, still believed that my once obedient and submissive son would soften at a few cheap tears. Emil, Freya sobbed, reaching out to touch my son's chest. Your father, he has lost his mind. I don't know what he did with the bank account. I am just a victim here. Emil, we can start over. And what about our child? I stood leaning against the kitchen door frame, my arms crossed over my chest, quietly observing. I didn't need to intervene, because I knew my son had died and come back to life since the night he discovered the house valuation paper. Emil took a step back, avoiding Fraser's hand as if avoiding some filthy trash. He looked at her not with anger, but with an ultimate, bone-chilling contempt. Don't use a non-existent life to bargain with me for another second, Fraser. Emil's voice hardened, every word as sharp as a cleaver cutting through the suffocating air. You aren't pregnant. You carried a conspiracy. You used the illusion of a child to force me to kneel and pick up barbecue meat on your family's lawn while you stood there smirking with your friends. The fake ultrasound paper you hid in the drawer, I threw it in the trash, along with the last bit of respect I had for you. Fraser was speechless. Her bulging eyes rolled back, sheer terror clearly showing when she realized all her layers of camouflage had been stripped completely bare. She turned to look at me, her eyes pleading for help. I stepped forward, tapping my calloused fingers rhythmically on the wooden table. Your father personally signed the property waiver and cancelled all bank access. The financial death sentence for the Knudsen family is sitting in lawyer Pernill's safe. If you want to keep your last shred of dignity so you don't have to go to prison with your father, then pack up your rags and get out of my house in exactly 15 minutes. There was no screaming or arguing. There was no smashing of furniture. Faced with devastating legal evidence, Fraser was just a puppet with its strings cut. She kept her head down, silently packed her things into 2 suitcases, and left in the dark night. The sound of the door slamming echoed dryly, permanently severing the invisible shackles that had tightened around Emil's neck for 18 months. The divorce process afterward went smoothly and unbelievably fast. Lawyer Pernill Holm only needed to file the petition, and the Knudsen family signed it without daring to utter a word demanding a single dime, a car, or any property rights. They understood the rules of the game very well. Even the slightest move of resistance, the file of financial fraud, money laundering, and forged signatures, would immediately be sent straight to the Federal Investigation Bureau and Henrik's creditors. I had them by the throat, and their only choice was to remain silent in order to live. December 2024. The morning sky in Odense was clear, cold but bright with winter sunshine. At exactly 8 in the morning, I was standing by the stove making coffee when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on the gravel road in front of the house. The door swung open, and a cold breeze rushed in, carrying a ringing laugh. Grandpa Lars. Little Clara, my 7-year-old granddaughter from Emil's previous relationship, rushed into the kitchen like a tiny bullet, hugging my leg tightly. The little girl wore a red wool coat, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Right behind her, Emil walked in. That sight made my heartbeat pause slightly with emotion. The haggard, sweat-drenched son, bowing and kneeling under the summer sun back then, had completely disappeared. Standing before me now was a radiant Emil, his back straight, his chest full of the vitality of a completely free man. His eyes lit up with the self-esteem and core strength he had inherited from his mother. We brought croissants for you, Dad. Emil laughed loudly, placing the bag of pastries on the table. Clara insisted on buying the one with the most butter, because she said Grandpa liked that. Of course, my granddaughter always knows best. I bent down and lifted Clara up. Grandpa, I have a gift for you. Clara wriggled to get down, then pulled out from her tiny backpack a crayon drawing that was slightly crumpled at the corner. She smoothed it out and carefully placed it on the kitchen table. I looked down at the drawing. The innocent crayon strokes depicted a small wooden house with a chimney. Standing in front of the house were 3 people, me, Emil, and Clara, holding hands. But in the right corner of the drawing, the little girl had drawn another woman in a blue dress with brown hair, smiling gently and standing right next to me. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice suddenly choking up. "It's Grandma Astrid." Clara grinned, her clear eyes looking at me. "Dad Emil said that Grandma was very smart. She told Grandpa how to protect the house. So I drew her standing here so she would stay with our family forever." A hot drop of water rolled down my wrinkled cheek. I quickly raised the hand with the 1990 welding scar to wipe it away before Clara could see. I held the drawing with both hands, walking over to the fireplace in the living room. I carefully placed my granddaughter's crayon drawing on the mantelpiece, right next to Astrid's black and white photograph. I stepped back, looking at the 2 most important women in my life. I had kept my promise. There are people who believe that power lies in wearing designer clothes, snapping fingers to give orders, and trampling on the dignity of others. But they were wrong. When backed into a corner, violence or screaming are only the tools of the weak. True strength, the kind of strength that can bring down an entire arrogant empire, lies in discipline, cold material evidence, and the ruthless silence of a father willing to do anything to protect his family. The 8 steps I held back on the grass that day were exactly the 8 steps I walked straight to this absolute victory. The story of Lars Moeller concludes here. Thank you for listening and accompanying me through every tense breath of this bloodless battle. If this story touched you, if you ever had to bite your tongue and endure the oppression of toxic people to protect what you love, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories of survival and turning the tables. And the final advice I want to send to you through this story: life isn't always fair, and sometimes those who carry the title of family are the most cruel. Don't ever respond with loud anger when you are cornered. Gather evidence, keep a cold head, and remember, carefully prepared silence is always more lethal than any fist. Protect your boundaries, because justice only belongs to those who know how to hold the evidence. See you again in the next videos.